Good afternoon to all of you, and thank you so much for joining us on yet another session of Reboot Saturdays. I am Shuha Gangopadhyay. I'm a specialist in the curriculum team at Harappa Education, and I've been here for almost 2 years now working on building the courses and building the curriculum offering that we have at Harappa. Before this, I worked at Ashoka University as an administrator and a teaching assistant. Um, so, for those of you who may have joined us on earlier Reboot Saturday sessions, you may have realized that we've been missing for a couple of months, but that's only because we were trying really hard and working very hard to put together this extremely special session for you today, where our guest is going to be Meekin Maheshwari. And hi, Meekin. Today with Meekin, we are going to be connecting the dots and understanding the relationship between being a lifelong learner and the importance of embracing and navigating change. So let me just give you a quick introduction to who Meekin is before we move any further. Meekin is the founder of Udhyam Learning Foundation. He works with the youth of the country and helps them realize their entrepreneurial potential. Before he started Udhyam, Meekin worked for almost 7 years with Flipkart, where he first worked in technology. Then he moved on to handling a couple of Flipkart's smaller businesses and eventually moved on to become the chief people's officer. And before he was at Flipkart, he worked in data and systems. So, as you can see from this very illustrious introduction, Meekin is quite the man of diversity and he's dabbled in quite a few portfolios. So, of course, who better than to talk about change and learning and moving from one context to another. Meekin has also been involved in quite a few startups, quite a few famous startups, in fact, such as Urban Clap and Nudge Foundation as an angel investor. So, Meekin, hi, good afternoon. How are you doing? Thank you so much for taking time out on a Saturday afternoon and joining us.
Thank you so much, Suha, for the opportunity. Looking forward to an exciting conversation.
Yes, absolutely. This should be a good session, right? So, Meekin, today we are going to talk about change. And that, of course, given the fact that we are currently residing in a COVID-stricken world, we've all been thrown into a lot of chaos and a lot of change. I wanted to know from you what this lockdown has meant for you, and what are the kinds of changes that your work life has gone through.
It's been intense. So around early March, I ended up being one of the 5 people who started a volunteering group around COVID. It's called Startups versus COVID. So the first 3 weeks post that were very, very intense, with us trying to figure out what is it that we could be doing. And we were grappling. It's learning on a daily basis and figuring out what is it that we could be doing. And that is along with the 2 organizations that I already work with, Udhyam and Game. Plus, about another month back, I joined ACT Grants, which is again trying to figure out that, hey, what are things which initiatives, which innovations could help us reduce the impact of COVID on both health as well as economy. So from a work front, it's been fairly hectic. And the joyous part, besides just seeing so many people volunteer, has been the time spent with kids. I have 2 young kids, and getting to spend a lot of time with them, whether it's playing chess or badminton or doing pranks at home, have been fun.
We also must be getting spoiled having access to you all
yes.
the time now.
I now have to negotiate a lot for my meetings.
Okay, so just to let everybody know in the audience, what we're going to do in today's session is we're going to go through some of the concepts and frameworks that we think at Harappa help a person become a lifelong learner, especially in the face of change. And I'm going to introduce those concepts to you and then hand them over to Meekin, and he's going to take you through those concepts and frameworks in the context of his life journey as a learner navigating change at different points in time. So, let's not waste any more time and jump straight in. Let's just quickly look at what these frameworks are. So we'll talk about the relationship between learning and change and how crucial a role curiosity plays in being a learner. Then we'll quickly move on to share some pointers on how you can learn from your successes and apply these learnings from one context that you pick up from one context into another context. And then finally, we're going to talk about the importance of situational leadership in during a crisis of change. And this is actually one thing that is quite close to Meekan's heart, I believe. So, we're all looking forward to see what he has to share with us on that. And once we're done with all these frameworks and concepts, we're going to open up the floor to you, the audience, for your questions that we're going to try and address them in as accurate and succinct a manner as possible. But please do note that we may be taking some questions as we move along. So please make sure that whatever pressing questions you may have, just please keep sending them in to us on the chat box and the Q&A box. Okay, so first up, we have learning is greater than change, which is a formula. If we can move on to the next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. So for those of you who, like me, feel intimidated with either formula or equations, this is actually a fairly simple one, so don't worry about it. So L is greater than C is simply, it simply means that in order to be a lifelong learner, you need to be ahead of change. In other words, your rate of learning should be ahead the rate of change. So when we see change, in many cases, these changes as young professionals or professionals in their mid-level career, a lot of the changes we actually plan ourselves, right? So we decide to move to a different city or decide to move to a different job, decide to change industries. But the change that we're going to talk about today in today's session is purely one that comes and hits us in the face without any warning, and we've not managed to anticipate it before. Very much like the current world that we are living in right now. And suddenly you're trudging along, and then all your plans just sort of seem to go awry, and you're left there picking up the pieces. And in such a situation, the learnings that you have picked up already in your earlier experiences will come in very handy while navigating these new circumstances. So, Meekan, let me bring this now to you. Would you say that constant learning is important or crucial for embracing or navigating change?
Yes, strong yes. I think in some sense, we've known that change is constant. And so maybe in the 90s, I used to hear that change is constant. And in the last 10 years, what I've been hearing is change is accelerating. So not only is change happening, but the rate of change is increasing more and more, right? To me personally, change happened a lot in my early life. And in some sense, that played a role in my learning ability. So just to have context, I went to 7 different schools to finish my 12 years of education.
All right.
And as in living in about 5 cities, actually all 5 small towns. And as a result, what used to happen to me is that you move to a new place, you have new school, new teachers, new friends, you take some time to adapt, and slowly you get the hang of the place, and boom, you're out again, right? And so every 2 years, I was in a new place, adapting, constantly figuring out like, okay, in this new place, what is going on, and how do I now adapt to this new place? And I think that early exercise of the muscle of adaptability played a large role in how I have looked at change. So one is, it's meant that I have never been afraid of change. I now think of change as opportunity. And in some sense, to me, being ahead of change almost means driving change, right? So not only are you reacting to change, you're actually creating change. You are figuring out that, hey, how should change happen? Right? And whether it's working at Flipkart, which enabled change to happen in terms of how could people who are used to buying offline start buying online. So that's what, in some sense, creation of change would mean. But this idea of every new change leads to an opportunity to learn, right? And being able to use that. And if you are if you're willing to uh, start from scratch, uh, and not be afraid,
Right.
then every change is a large opportunity to learn. And it's, again, a lot of it is visible in how 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 Suha talked about my career has been. So while the learning life was not a place where I had a lot of agency, I, like, given a choice, I don't think I would have gone through that many changes. I
Yeah.
would have loved to keep my friends. Right, like, because I don't have friends before sixth grade, because, like, despite having Facebook and all of these social networks, I do not even remember the names, because after sixth grade I changed four schools. So while I didn't enjoy it then, and that's with any muscle building,
Yeah.
right? That there is stress, and it's not without its pains. But as a result, uh, in my professional life, uh, I've been able to take on opportunities which otherwise seem fairly radical to people, or do changes which to people feel radical. Whether it's moving from being now what's called popularly a data scientist to building systems, uh, jumping out of established companies into like zero people or two people startups, uh, and then within startups being able, like, moving to e-commerce companies, uh, moving from a technology role to a business role, or from a business role to an HR role, and then from HR to now doing what I'm doing, which is in the space of learning and entrepreneurship. And a lot of us are told that our careers are straight lines,
Right.
right? And we have simple trajectories that, hey, you do A, B, C, D, E in this order, and then life is set. I feel life is a far more beautiful journey than that. You can actually learn from every experience, and then let the experience take you, or you decide where can you go next, without it being fixated on, like, okay, this is the only path.
And you have so much more agency to do that as well, right? I mean, you have your own will that you're going to exercise depending on what you want to do. Don't go become an engineer if you don't want to, just because
Yeah,
society wants you to do it, right?
absolutely.
So, this is actually a very interesting segue into our next point, which is on curiosity. And also, Meekin, you shared quite a bit about your childhood, and while you were moving from one school to another, one city to another, you must have also been quite curious as to why you were being forced to go through this experience, right?
Yeah. um, I think I was curious about trying to figure out what's happening around me,
Right, right, right.
and whether it's adapting to different cultures, like how people in West Bengal are versus how people in, say, the city of Jamshedpur, or Tata Nagar as it's called,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
or places in Kashmir where I
Right.
lived. So trying to make sense of and understanding from the cultures around and learning from them. So I think that definitely played a role. Uh,
Great. So, then let's talk a little more about curiosity, because I think there may be a little bit of a misconception in the world that curiosity is an inherent quality, that, somebody is born with curiosity, or children are inherently curiosity. And as they move towards adulthood, perhaps, a lot of it sort of dies out. But what we're trying to talk about here is actually the fact that curiosity is a skill that can and should be developed and honed over time. And you can develop curiosity by just following 3 steps. And these are the 3 steps. They're very simple, they're very straightforward. First, of course, is try and pick up different kinds of new information, because you never know what tidbit of data, statistics, ideas, concepts may come in handy later on. They may not be very relevant to your current context, but a few years down the line, you may actually find a place in the scope to apply them somewhere. The second, of course, is seek guidance and feedback. In many cases, you are not alone on your journey, and there may be people who may have traversed your path before you. So why not go to them, and why not ask them what they think? Pick their brains on what you should be. And this could be your boss, this could be a mentor at the workplace, this could be your teacher, your professor, or this could just be a senior, from your school or your college, who whose work you admire and whom you look up to, and you just want to find out what their life journeys have been like, and if they have any pearls of wisdom to share with you. And the third one, very simply, it's probably the absolutely foundational step towards building a curiosity, and that's asking the three questions: what, why, and how. Um, and Meekin, I mean, these questions have been fairly instrumental in making you who you are, right?
Yeah, I I remember like the idea of, or the area of question reminds me of a nickname that my college friends used to call me. I was called Mr. Doubtfire, named after a famous movie of Mrs. Doubtfire that Robin Williams played an amazing role in. So happy to have the name, but the name came from the point that ये class में सोने नहीं देता है, right? This person just does not allow us to rest in class, and he always has doubts, he always has questions. So it was a name coming out of frustration from my classmates that and why can't you just sit quietly. And for me, unless something became clear in my head, right, unless I understood and could then replay it in my own understanding and my own words, I generally wasn't satiated. I wasn't, and that's the element of curiosity, to not take anything just because it is being said, to try and find out why do things happen the way they do, and how do things happen. So the why and how questions have been exceptionally powerful, and they've played a large role in my journey as an engineer, in constantly trying to figure out from a how point of view as an engineer, like how stuff works, right? Like, oh, how am I able to speak to somebody on the telephone, right? And why? So that's on the how part, which is trying to constantly understand what's going on and how are things working, and that allows me to think about, okay, how can it be improved. But also, so the how in some sense leads me on the technology path. Asking the why question helps me understand, or has helped me understand people a lot better, right? So like, why do people do something, right? Why do we not buy online, or why do we prefer, even though we know that, hey, certain things are healthy for us, we continue to do certain things which are unhealthy for us, like take fitness for example, and all of us know what's right for us, but the number of us who practice it is much smaller. So why this difference? And just pursuing these why questions, or and then also exploring what if, right? And imagining new solutions to that. I think these have been key parts of just staying curious. I do think that we are all curious. Uh, very often, uh, very often, what happens is that in the urge to find focus and productivity, and that no, I have to focus and get to my goal. And by the way, that's important. Uh, we we shun away real world experiences, right? We go away and we do not necessarily enjoy and follow our own instincts towards, oh, when you see a mango which is different colored or differently shaped, why that might be the case. Or like, I recently saw a bonsai mango, and hey, like, how and why, and can it be done more often, and can mangoes then grow inside balconies? uh,
Point, Meekin, because one of the questions that has actually come in from one of our attendees, um, and perhaps you can also address that, is, how can a student be curious apart from in their academic life? So is learning and curiosity only something that a student within a conventional academic structure exercise? Or is it something that one can be for for larger sections of life?
I I think I think curiosity is lifelong, right? It's an opportunity to live life in a more interesting way.
Yes.
I do think that as students, we have very few other distractions, or well, there are other distractions, but at least there are much fewer responsibilities, right? And you're not worried about a whole bunch of other things. So it's a great place and great time to be curious. Here, I do feel that a lot of our traditional Indian educational system uh, does not necessarily provide as much opportunity to explore. So for example, I like in my undergrad or in my engineering course, I would have loved to do economics and psychology along with technology, right? To like this curiosity about understanding why people do certain things has been there for a long time. And doing that in terms of psychology, I would have loved to take on courses, but
Right.
that opportunity uh, is
Presented.
lower.
Right.
And
Right.
hence, I ended up doing it on my own.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But I wish those opportunities were more. And as a student, if you're curious, just pursuing that opportunity
Yeah.
can be very powerful.
So you just said that you did a lot, you did all of this learning on your own, and a lot of what you have also done is learn from your successes. So let's talk about that, Meekin. Let's move on to that point, and let's talk about how achieving success is actually not just about doing really well while completing one particular task or one particular project. It's actually an event. It's a legitimate event that you can learn from, that you can take learnings, you have takeaways from, and it's not just this feel good and this sense of being high for a small period of time for succeeding in the conventional sense of the term. So how you succeed and what your reaction to success is actually also something that pushes you ahead in your journey to becoming or continuing to be a learner. So when you have succeeded, you know there are about third yes there are 3 points that you need to be aware of so that you can learn from your success. And the first one is constantly look for opportunities to improve. So just because you've done well in one thing does not mean that there's no scope for improvement, that there's no other way in which you could have perhaps done a better job. So do look out for feedback. Second is think creatively. Try not to look at one particular task or one particular project through the conventional lens. Try and see if you can put yourself in somebody else's shoes and try and look at the problem from their perspective. And it's amazing how many different options, solutions are going to present themselves to you. And finally, avoid comfort zones. All of us, I think, are a little sometimes guilty of not wanting to push ourselves harder. We work in one space, one job, one organization for about 4 or 5 years, and we get to a point where we can practically do our jobs in our sleep. But that's not always a great thing if you want to keep learning. You need to put yourself out there. You need to take a couple of risks. You need to see and dabble in things that you've never done before. So like Nikin, what are some of the learnings that you have picked up from your successes? Anything that sort of you can share with us?
Yeah. Uh, I think I connect very deeply with the first and the third point, which is uh, I have a strong belief that everything can be improved, right? And maybe the only exception I would make is nature, but everything man-made can definitely be improved. It is what it is because that's the level to which people before us have been able to think, have been able to create. Whether it is the education system, whether it is traffic, whether it is how we use the phone. And if you think about it, like the way things are changing,
Yeah.
it's only evident to us that, hey, today we cannot imagine life without a smartphone. And to imagine that 10 years back, this wasn't the case. So it requires constantly thinking of, okay, how can things be made better?
Right.
uh, a lot of personal experiences from Flipkart, uh, where at any point of time, if we sat and did our strengths and weaknesses, uh, that chart would have maybe 3 or 4 points under strengths and generally have about 10 to 12 points under weaknesses. And it was this spirit of being self-critical, of finding flaws in ourselves and wanting to get better at them,
Right.
uh, that I think led Flipkart to continue to work and continue to improve.
Right.
We like I call this culture, as in this, along with another part of the culture, audacity, at Flipkart, where we weren't content with, say, just being the best bookseller in the country. Right? Flipkart got there by 2010, 2011. Flipkart was the largest bookseller in the country, right? And we could have easily said that, hey, we've achieved great success, and we can continue to be the best bookseller in the country, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
But Flipkart took that success and said that, okay, with this, what can we learn and how can we do this in other areas? So we started selling mobile phones, and you'd be surprised that it wasn't easy. So the first 6 months of trying to sell mobile phones were very, very hard for Flipkart. And this was shocking because if you think about the Indian consumer, I don't think a lot of people in India voluntarily buy books and read. But almost everybody back then in 2011-12 was buying phones. And yet Flipkart was a company that was selling more books than phones. And we had to really think and work hard on figuring out what would it take for people to trust us to buy phones. And that journey, even though it's hard, is the learning journey. It's when you try something difficult, when you get out of your comfort zone.
Yeah.
And just because you've succeeded in something doesn't mean that you will automatically succeed in the next thing.
Right.
But willing to start from scratch and willing to learn is what leads you to the next success.
Absolutely. Great. And since you are talking about, moving on, let's quickly look at our next concept, which is the idea of transfer of learning. And so if you have pushed yourself out of your comfort zone, and if you are trying to figure out if you can do something new, this doesn't mean that your success in your earlier experiences, gets completely negated. In fact, the point of learning from your success is that it should be able to lead you to greater heights. Right? And this is exactly where the idea of transferability of learning comes in. But what do we exactly mean by this? It's so, just to give you an example about me, I've worked in education my whole life. And so let me just share an example from there. So because of the COVID outbreak and because of the subsequent lockdown, we saw schools and colleges having to pretty much move all of their courses online, which meant that teachers and professors had to suddenly overnight adapt and learn from a new medium, learn to teach on a new medium. And this could not have been easy. In fact, for those who are slightly more senior and slightly more set in their ways, it was quite a challenge to figure all of this out in such a short span of time. But what they did was, they tried to tap into the learnings that they already have, that has already made them successful teachers so far, and tried to figure out if there was a way to apply those learnings to the new context. So they all knew that, participation and encouraging their students to participate in class is something that improves the quality of learning in their coursework. And so what they had to then eventually figure out was to, they had to figure out how they could build in this participatory element for their students in the virtual classroom. So then either through conducting quizzes on Kahoot or using breakout rooms on Zoom, this is how they tried to ensure that they continued to have that element going strong in their courses as well. And Meekin, for you as well, like you've moved from a startup space to a not-for-profit, and there may be certain similarities and certain dissimilarities, but what are some of the things that you have transferred, some of the learnings that you have transferred from your Flipkart days to your functioning of Udhyam today?
Yeah, let's start with a specific example, right, around motivation. So I think what I'm most proud of at what I was able to do at Flipkart was the team that I built. So the technology team that got built at Flipkart between 2009 to 12. That's, I feel, my proudest professional achievement. And a lot of that was to do with the motivation levels of the team members and just how much ownership they took, how much they thought of Flipkart as their company versus being just another workplace. And there, when I look back, one of the frameworks that I was aware of back then and that I felt a lot more strongly for since is this framework that Daniel Pink talks about in motivation theory. As in, there are a lot more researchers who've talked about it, but he has simplified it for mass consumption, which he talks about purpose, autonomy, and mastery. right? That if you have a strong purpose, so people walk behind Gandhi because of purpose.
Yeah.
That they connect with what the mission is, right? So they work in a lot of company. A lot of people may work for a company because of the mission. Second is autonomy, which is about like, hey, how much decision making power I have, and what do I get to decide? And people generally have much higher ownership of things that they are a part of the decision making.
Right.
Right? And pursuit of mastery. So if I get to constantly become better at something, and ideally something that I enjoy, that is a huge motivator for people. So being able to apply this framework to employee motivation in building the teams, right? So building autonomous teams where there was significant amount of autonomy for people. There was connection constantly with the purpose of Flipkart, that they were both asked as customers that, hey, how would you want the Flipkart experience to be? And be able to then realize that in terms of their work. So make that happen. and and like allowing and enabling a strength focused culture so that people could pursue their own mastery. I think those pieces that I did for employee motivation at Flipkart is exactly what I'm now doing at Udyam for student motivation. So we work with young learners to try and build entrepreneurial mindsets. And a core part of what we do is with government school students in say 11th and 12th, get them to do an entrepreneurial project where they have to decide like what is the entrepreneurial project that they want to do. And we trust them with a small loan. But the decision making is all there. So the autonomy and the connection with the purpose that, hey, this is your project, this is your business. And we've seen magic, right? Like we've had parents tell us that like my son is waking up at 4 in the morning to be able to go and purchase this from the city market, and I had to like shake and wake him up for his board exams at 7 a.m. So this shift in the amount of ownership that people take once they believe something is theirs, once their motivation levels are high. So I used a specific example, but the idea is to be able to see what like the the idea is not just about like, oh, this is how you motivate employees, but to think about, okay, how does motivation work for humans, right? And then it can be deployed in how do you motivate salespeople, how do you motivate a community, how do you motivate your students, and so on. So being able to transfer that learning to various different contexts and contextualizing it, I feel is how I have done it, and I feel happy about having gotten the opportunity to do this across many different roles, whether it's data or it's technology or it's as an HR as well as now education.
Right, right. So here's an interesting question that has just come in actually, Mekin, and if you can answer that, do executives learn from the consequences of their actions, whether the outcome is a success or a failure?
I feel it's the only way we learn, right? That we really only learn through our actions and ideally through the consequences of the actions. So it's the consequences that is the real teacher. You decide something. So I'll take and maybe not, uh, maybe not take an executive example, take a layman example, right? That I live in Bangalore, which is before COVID had gotten to be known as a traffic city in India, or the worst traffic city in India. And you realize that, hey, if you leave home at 9:30 a.m., it takes you 1 hour to get to office. But if you leave home at 9:15 a.m., you can get to office in half an hour, right? And that's just actions or decisions and consequences.
Right.
And based on that, you learn. So it's a very simplified way of communicating that this is how we learn.
Right.
And the same thing applies to strategic decisions that boards make. That, oh, you decided to invest in technology, or you decided to invest in building a team, or you decided to invest in a brand or in marketing. And then what were the consequences? And then based on those consequences, you learn what do you do better, what do you do more of from your successes. Also, what can you do better, which could come from your failures, or as in things that haven't yet achieved success. So I think of both failure and successes as basically phases, right? Neither of them has any finality to it. It's final only if we decide to make it final.
Yeah. It's not final, but it's definitely movable and it's definitely transferable. And so if you are learning from one success and a failure, it will help you figure out how you are going to navigate change in a different context, right? Okay, so now we're going to move to the last theory for this afternoon, and that is the theory of situational leadership. So, being a lifelong learner and adapting to change as a skill is something that is a skill that we all need to develop, especially for a time when, people are put into leadership roles. So let's talk about situational leadership in that context. It was originally developed by organizational behaviorists Paul Hersey and Ken Blanchard. And this theory has, of course, many aspects that are very well worth pursuing. But for the interest of today's session, we are going to only focus on the situational aspect of it. So, what does this really mean? Simply put, this theory of leadership talks about adapting one's leadership styles, not based on the task or job at hand, but based on the interests of their followers and what is going to help them grow. So the need of the hour is to adapt to the situation. Need of the hour is for the leader to adapt to the situation, basis what is good for their team. In fact, from an earlier conversation from Meekin, he made a very interesting point about how you need to adapt your storytelling skills, right? Depending on whether you're telling a story to a 5-year-old or a 50-year-old. So this is something that's very similar to that. So then, Meekin, there is a need for change and there is a need for adapting, right? So you are fairly also personally, you are somebody who's very influenced by this theory. So why don't you tell us a little more about how you feel about it?
Sure. I think the theory is worthwhile to explore in detail, but we may not have time for all of it. So I'll bring up some of those elements. Right? That if change is constant, then you have to keep adapting. And I think one of the larger myths about leadership or has been that it is a lot about being consistent, doing the same thing repeatedly, being very principled, right, and standing up for your values. And while all of that is completely true, I think the piece that's not talked about as much is how do you adapt in different situations, right? That okay, you have so you should be customer centric, but you should be customer centric across all situations. But what does customer centricity mean in a time where say something like COVID is going on, right? And let's take the example of because of my volunteering efforts, I got to interact quite a bit with governments during this COVID effort. And I've been working with governments for the last 3-4 years for the educational pieces that I work with in government schools. And I see a stark difference in how a lot of the government officials have adapted in terms of their decision making. So in general, in regular peacetime, if you can call it that, government decision making is reasonably slow. It has to be very thoughtful, like, hey, that will it achieve the interest of very large number of people and so on. And they have enough other pulls to slow down the process. But when dealing with COVID, uh, we've had governments move at a rate that's unimaginable. Uh, from getting helplines up and running in less than 24 hours to being able to deploy software solutions and technology solutions, which otherwise government moves very slowly on, again in like matter of days and not even weeks, is an example of adapting to the situation, right? Which in this case is COVID led. The other part of situational leadership is again, as a leader and as say someone who's managing a team, you think of that, hey, I have to be consistent and do the same thing for everyone, right? And while that's important as an outcome, that you have to be fair and you should not come across as biased or playing favorites, every individual in your team has different needs.
Right.
There might be individuals who need more instruction. There might be individuals who actually need just a little push or a nudge. Trying to give the person who needs only a small nudge, trying to give them too much instruction will kill their agency. Right? And similarly, somebody who needs a lot more instruction, somebody who's new in an area, uh, and not giving them enough instructions could possibly lead them on path of too many failures and break their confidence.
Right.
So, so the situational leadership talks about that. Hey, understand the situation you are in. Right. At the core of it, it is about keep your eyes and ears open,
Right.
listen and understand, and then use your head. Right. Not just blindly going ahead. So we often take these theories and then just go implement them without really contextualizing them, without really thinking that, hey, what's happening around me?
Absolutely.
And that's all situational leadership is saying, that keep your eyes and ears open and listen to what's happening, see what's happening, adapt, and then implement.
That's interesting because situational leadership is then not just for those in leadership positions. It's actually something that you can also use to lead yourself, right? And each of us are reacting to the COVID outbreak and the lockdowns in our own individual ways. Everybody has their insecurities, worries, and they are trying to tackle it as best they can. So this is something that they may actually find helpful while trying to figure out what their reaction to this big change, big setback is going to be.
Absolutely. I feel leadership is not the same as being in a place of authority. Right?
Right.
Leadership is an action.
Yes.
Right? Leadership is basically actions that we take. If we decide to take a stand against something without anybody else giving us authority to do it, is leadership. Right? When you decide that, hey, in your apartment complex, this is how things will be for, say, for other people who work or who come from outside, and
Right.
you are playing a role in actively bringing people together, all of that is leadership. It may or may not come with formal authority.
Right.
And I think in all of that, the framework allows us to go through just a clearer understanding of how to deal with different situations, and being open to the. In my opinion, it's a learning journey that all of us go through. That situational leadership talks about how we start out with very high energy and excitement about a new topic that we are learning. So I started learning Sanskrit about almost a year back now. It doesn't feel that long. I've learned very little, but
It is a difficult language to master.
yes. And I started off with very high energy and excitement, right? Which is what situational leadership says you start out with. But
Right.
at that point, I needed a lot more instruction,
Right.
right? And thankfully, I had a mentor who gave me a lot more instructions.
Hmm.
And then very soon, I went into not having built enough capability, but realizing how difficult the language is.
Yeah.
And at that point, I needed not just instruction, but also motivation,
Right.
right? Like have an inspiring teacher who would motivate you. And then you slowly build capability, and then you start enjoying, and then both
Sure.
capability and energy are eventually high. But this is a learning journey that all of us go through with every topic that we might take up.
And this is also what helps, and I'm just going to make this one last point and then we can move on to taking our audience questions. And this ability to also keep moving from one point to another is also what builds agility, right? It's also what helps us move from one crisis or one change to another, take our learnings from one point to another, and that's also how we go on to build capability and improve our levels of agility. uh, thank you so much, Meekin. That's actually been great. This is a very succinct and simplified understanding and version of the situational leadership module that you've shared with us today. The first question, but actually, before we move on to the questions, I just want to let our attendees know that we have our Embracing Change course on offer, and it's online. It's free and online for all of you, so please do sign up. I know that my colleagues have also been posting the links on the chat box, so please make sure that you do click on it and register for it. All the points about change and how to navigate change and deal with it have been covered in this course, and it's very topical for the world that we live in right now. So moving on, Meekin, the first question um, that we had come in right at the beginning of the session was, what does it take to keep ourselves calm and cool while going through a great change? And I think it's interesting because all of us have been talking about tips and tricks and tools that we can equip ourselves with But the first thing is our immediate reaction to change, which is usually an oh no. It's either a fight or a flight. So how do you keep yourselves cool?
I think I think the phrase that comes to me is basically acceptance. Right? It starts with acceptance. That all change it starts with just realization and acceptance that hey, this is here. Right? You can fly. You can run away from it. But there are very few changes that you can actually truly avoid.
Right.
Given that the world is changing rapidly, it's it's much better to get comfortable with the idea of change. So a lot of it is training our instincts on what is our instinctive response to change.
Right.
And some of it is going to be there. I won't say that hey, I've never felt, like I said, when I was a child I didn't necessarily enjoy all the changes that I was going through.
Absolutely.
But just that practice of doing that, and like like any muscle building, uh, gets you to then not worry about it so much, that oh, it's not so hard. So like change happens. The first time I moved from a Hindi medium school to an English medium school, I failed in 5 of the 8 subjects in the first term, and I was like devastating. Right? But then it's part of life, and then by the end of the term, by the end of the year, I had caught up and was again doing reasonably well academically. Uh, so it's And once you've been through this a couple of times, 2 or 3 times, you've put yourself in hard places and you've been able to learn, you realize that it's not so bad. You can actually learn. And once you have this confidence of being able to learn, then on you don't worry too much about change.
Yeah, this
uh,
is actually an interesting relationship between confidence and learning. Learning does lead you to improve your levels of confidence, and you also need to. The other flip side is also that there is a certain level of confidence that you also need to have in yourself
yeah,
to actually continue to learn.
absolutely.
Okay, Mekin, how do you gauge in advance whether a change is going to be an opportunity or a disaster? Is there a way to test out in advance?
So I'm an optimist, and I start out with a position of that every change is an opportunity, right? And uh, at a minimum, it's an opportunity to learn.
Yeah.
Right? Now, whether that opportunity translates into whatever career gains, financial gains, or not, uh, it depends on how things play out, and some of those may not be in your control.
Right.
Uh, right? And there, I feel we are lucky. We've grown up with the wisdom from the Gita that maybe results are not in our control. Our actions are. Uh, and as long as we view change as opportunity and do the best that we can, uh, sometimes things may not work out. And if we keep learning and keep questioning why did things not work out, ask those questions, and the next attempt have better inputs.
Right.
So
Right.
I'm also a deep believer of Einstein said this beautiful things that hey, if you have the same input and you expect different output, that's being stupid, right? Your inputs have to change. Something has to change for the outputs to be different. So as long as you keep learning and keep changing your inputs, keep changing whether it's the hours you work or how you work or how you organize your work, who are you talking to, and so on, and then you apply yourself, your outputs will change. So my answer is that every change is an opportunity.
Meekan, the next question is actually a fairly philosophical one, and those of us who are joining us here on this session who hail from the education sector may actually find this quite intriguing. How would you differentiate between learning and education?
Uh, uh, okay, so I care a lot more about learning. I feel education is the sector or the field, right? That we've given ourselves. Um I have a much stronger and slightly radical response to learning versus schooling.
Mhm.
But if we think about it, the the idea uh, of boxing learning under education, uh, to me, is a dangerous idea.
Mm.
It tells us that, oh, you learn for the first 15, 20 years of your life, and then you work, right? And I don't think learning stops ever,
Right.
right?
Absolutely.
I actually feel that I have learned a lot more when I started working.
Hence,
Right?
the session.
And it stays constant.
Yeah.
So your learning is happening all the time. And to box it in education, as long as now education is talking about an ongoing education and constant education and education for adults and so on. And as long as education starts to become as broad as learning is, I feel that's fine. But otherwise, the danger, I think, with combining education and learning to mean the same is that so far education mostly means what you do from ages 5 to maybe 20, 25, right? And then you stop education. uh, and to me that feels dangerous.
I think also education is a much more physical experience, right? It's the space that you are in, because there is a lot of conventional training that goes into it. How your college life is supposed to be, what your school experiences are supposed to be like. Learning, on the other hand, is a lot more intellectual or a mental journey. And it's something that's very individualistically, how do I put it? Um,
Yeah, it's very personal.
Also very personal, exactly. So it's also very customized. I will learn what I want to, and I want to take away learnings from what I want to, as opposed to being drilled or forced to drill something into my head.
And I would hope that our education can get personalized.
Yes, yes,
Like I think we can't shy away from the reality that each of us is unique. All
yes,
our learning styles are different, right? But we unfortunately do not have different education styles. Education continues to work as if we're all the same.
right,
And I wish that would change.
right,
So I
yes,
care a lot more deeply about learning.
right,
I wish our education systems can become more learning centered and learner centered.
right. Okay, Mikin, how does one find out what they should do with their life?
Experiment, right? So I think one is to ask yourself the question. So I'll tell you my personal story. At the young age of 35, sitting inside a boardroom at Flipkart where we were trying to imagine strategy for the next 10 years for Flipkart, one of my colleagues was helping us visualize, okay, what would the world look like 10 years from today? What does Flipkart look like 10 years from today? And what do you look like 10 years from today?
Right,
That's the first time I realized that, hey, while I'd enjoyed every bit of what I'd done, I wasn't necessarily like monetary and financial success alone weren't necessarily large drivers for me. And just continuing to play a corporate role uh, wasn't necessarily the largest of drivers for me. And at that young age, I then started asking myself the question, what do I care about? Right? What do I enjoy doing? Right? And finally, in some sense, the most philosophical of the questions, who am I? Right? And I won't pretend that I know the answers to all of them. But asking myself those questions have allowed me to get to know myself a little better
right,
and ensure that what I'm doing is better aligned or is is more integrated slash it's coming more from the inside
right,
versus just having to play a role,
right,
right? Like it's funny how the word of or the use of that word that in our corporate world we are playing a role as if it's an act, right? कि अच्छा वो drama है, that's a drama that you do, but then internally you are different.
yeah,
And I just feel that if what you are can be the role you play or can be as close to the role you play, you will bring a lot more to it than just maybe your mental capabilities or your skills. And I feel that's a lot more powerful. So so one is asking yourself these questions, but really the answer lies in real world experiences, right? That what do you enjoy doing most? When are you most in flow? When do you forget about everything else and you are having that much fun and that much joy? And what do you keep thinking about? Those are questions that really point you to what is pulling you.
yes, yeah,
And then to try it, because very often we start thinking about things because there are fancies about it, or we fantasize about something that, oh, it will be so cool if I got to be a jet pilot. Fantastic, right? But then you start asking the jet pilot that, hey, when do you wake up? He says 4 a.m. and then he works out for like 2 hours. So the physical fitness regime that you have to practice every day is, if that's not something that you're up for, then yeah, you're not, as in it doesn't make sense for you to keep fantasizing about being a jet pilot.
yeah,
So try it out, experiment with it, and then figure out what do you really enjoy.
So we have time, Meekin, for one last question. And that is, learning is a process which does not give quick results. So how can you stay self-motivated and consistent?
By enjoying it. Like if you're not having fun, I've realized, right, that you don't have to motivate young people to get onto TikTok.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
You don't have to motivate young people in India to go play cricket.
Right.
Right. And why is it that you need to motivate them to learn? And I feel there is probably the answer lies within there, that if people are having fun doing something,
If learning can be fun, if learning is something that's a fun
if the process itself is fun,
yeah.
then it may not necessarily require. That said, it's not that there aren't challenges. There are enough challenges in playing cricket, and there are enough challenges in, and it may not be as fun, but you still have to pursue it, right? So willing to go through some challenge, willing to go through some hardships, that does require motivation. And like I said, there is enough in motivation theory. One is to set yourself a goal. So if you have a purpose in mind, if you've aligned to like, hey, here is the objective, this is what I want to be doing in X years, or this is who I want to become, or this is the skill or the mindset I want to develop, that purpose can be a large motivator. Right. And besides that, you have to find joys in the process. Like otherwise, life is too short to be going through just pain all the time.
Absolutely. We actually have one more question that's come in. So if we can quickly also address that, Meekin, how do you manage rapid learning in the current time when there is such an overload of information from all directions?
Yeah, I think so this is a tricky one, right? And I wish I could have a short answer to it, because right now, I think we are flooded by the WhatsApp university. And it's so difficult to figure out what is true. So at the current moment, I feel trying to learn rapidly from informational uh, portals or websites or social media is actually dangerous. Uh, and I would recommend that go talk to people who are having real experiences. So if you want to work on, say, the challenge of people who are having to migrate from the cities back into towns, go talk to them, right? Yeah. Like talk to 20 of them. And that will tell you far more than any WhatsApp forward or any news article will. So I think getting connected to as close to ground as possible in today's world, I feel has become extremely important, because otherwise you have no idea of what you are being fed and for what reasons. And in trying to rapidly learn, you might end up doing a lot of disservice to yourself and others. So I would suggest that time box it, that, hey, you want to do this for some time. Say that, hey, these 5 weekends, I'm only going to be doing this.
Yeah.
Right. And then go after and do it on the ground, right, with real people. That would be my suggestion.
Going back to one of the points that we mentioned on curiosity as well, the 3 questions on what, why, and how. Keep also asking these questions, because there is so much information overload that's coming your way. Learn to pass through it by actually engaging with it critically. And trying to understand the validity and reliability of where this information is coming from and what it is, right? Okay, so this actually brings us to the end of this session. But before we do close, Meekin, do you want to take our attendees through your recommended resources list?
For sure. Yeah, these are books that changed my life. The design of everyday things. If you notice the teacup, and if you were to imagine yourself trying to pour tea out of that teapot, you will probably end up with a burnt hand. Yeah. Right. And it just talks about how thought and thoughtful design is so important when you're actually imagining things and creating things. So as a creator, and being able to assess and evaluate design, I think that's super important. So amazing book for anybody who is in the creative space. Isaac Asimov's Foundation series, to me, is the most audacious and most ambitious version of human aspiration. Right? It's talking about a world with 4 trillion people, where humans live in 100 million galaxies, and there the protagonist is trying to play a large role. I won't give any other spoilers, but uh, I found it very, very inspiring in terms of what we could, like, how audacious we could be. Sapiens is talked about enough. I don't have to do any more marketing for it. Amazing book, amongst the best thinkers of our times. Um, our Iceberg is Melting is a story of a penguin colony. It's a picture book, less than 100 pages, uh, amongst the best formats of learning in terms of management or thinking books conveyed as a story. So, even from a storytelling point of view, it's worthwhile to read. But more importantly, if you want to think about change, the story here is that one of the penguins has realized that the iceberg that the penguin colony lives in is melting. And if they do not act, the colony may not survive. And the journey then you have to go through. So, which is for every change agent. Anybody who's trying to drive any change has to take people along. And it's a very powerful story on how could you do it.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for sharing these recommendations with us. Meekin, just before we quickly wrap up, I want to do another reminder about our Embracing Change course. Please make sure that you do give it a shot, that you do sign up, register, and check out the course. It's an absolute treasure trove of ideas, concepts that will definitely help you navigate the current change that we are all encountering in this world today. Also, we have lots of more exciting webinars coming up for you in the month of June. The first of which is going to be with Rajat Gupta. We're starting a new Visionary Leadership series. It's going to be on 13th June from 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. and it's definitely going to help us beat the year that is 2020. Meekin, thank you so much for taking out time and joining us. This has been a great session, and I think from what I can gather from our audience comments as well, I think they've also really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Suhat. Thank you, audience. I hope this was fun.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for joining us as well. And stay tuned for all that Harappa has to offer, webinars, courses, all of it. Thank you so much.
Keep learning. Yeah. Bye.